US companies in China, frankly, are exhausted after 3 years of COVID zero. They're concerned. There are a number of challenges, some geopolitical, a lot of them on the ground economic.
Made in China. We've become accustomed to seeing the label on products manufactured in the world's second biggest economy, but buying one of these products in China instead of, say, the US doesn't guarantee you're getting a better price. So why is that? And what does it truly mean to be made in China?
If there's one way that epitomizes the globalization of the last few decades, it was made in China. China has been for years the world's largest manufacturer of toys, household appliances, and cooking utensils. Almost everything you can buy has been transported via China, either directly or indirectly. But what would you say if I told you that the made in China time may be coming to an end? What if I told you that China has been losing enterprises and reducing its overseas trade for years? We're talking about medium-sized businesses that supply major brands like Sony or Apple. Many of them are expanding their operations beyond the Asian giant, a chance that many countries, from Turkey to Bangladesh, are eager to seize. Apple intends to continue shifting its manufacturing away from China. Part of its goal is to focus more on India, and businesses like Samsung have already cut the number of employees in China by 2/3 since 2013. In the case of Apple, the Cupertino giant already makes 1 out of every 20 iPhones in India, with a plan to multiply that figure by 5 during the next 2 years. So, what is causing this? Why are businesses leaving China? And, perhaps more crucially, what kind of world would this disengagement between the Chinese and Western economies usher in? Is it a threat that could harm us? To comprehend why many businesses are leaving China or seeking alternatives to this market, the first thing we need to figure out is why they chose to establish a company there in the first place. As many of you probably already know, China was a very unfavorable location to do businesses for much of the 20th century. It was a country ruled by an iron-fisted communist dictatorship similar to that of Cuba or North Korea, a totalitarian all-encompassing government led by Mao Zedong, the supreme leader. I tell you that a company owner at the time would have picked any other country around the world to expand his or her business rather than China. However, beginning in the late 1980s, China began to attract tens of thousands of firms. The question is, how did the Chinese communist regime suddenly become appealing to businessmen from countries such as the United States? The explanation lies in the year 1976, when Mao Zedong, the Chinese dictator, passed away, leaving behind a new ruler, Deng Xiaoping, who dramatically transformed things. Deng Xiaoping was a politician who was additionally a member of the Chinese Communist Party, but who had a view of the economy that was extremely distinct from the one Mao took it. Let's simply note that Deng Xiaoping was more pragmatic and less blinded by communist ideas. Actually, one of his most famous quotes was that it didn't matter whether a cat was black or white, what mattered was that the cat catch mice. No matter if a political measure was deemed more or less socialist, what mattered was that it delivered results. That is exactly why Deng Xiaoping unveiled a huge plan to spark China's economy in 1979. A strategy that included expanding the international market and luring as many foreign firms as possible. In this approach, China effectively opened its doors to capitalism, or at the very least provided China with a foot in the door. So, what specific measures were implemented as part of this plan? Well, the answer may be divided into 2 parts. The first of these was a 1979 regulation that permitted international firms to set up company in China. Prior to the arrival of Deng Xiaoping, foreign companies were practically barred from entering the Asian country. As a result, the new law allows them to get into the country. It is also important to note that, in the beginning, international companies could only enter China if they offered the Chinese government a portion of their ownership, as if it were an alliance between the corporations and the country. However, by 1986, we had moved on. In any case, the second factor in attracting foreign firms was the establishment of special economic zones. These special zones are areas where foreign corporations pay lower taxes, are subject to less government regulations, have more flexible legal processes, and have a much better infrastructure than the rest of the country. Essentially, the government created a comfortable environment in which businesses could run effortlessly and profitably. The question is, did these steps have any effect? The answer is yes. Following Deng Xiaoping's arrival, the level of foreign investment began to increase. The Chinese government, on the other hand, was dissatisfied with the outcomes. Although the number of foreign enterprises has increased, the government desired to attract even more. So, what do you believe he did to bring in even more businesses? he introduced a new plan with even more significant and profound benefits than the first one. This second plan essentially expanded the first plan, at least in terms of taxation. In fact, they went so far as to offer foreign corporations an advantage over their own. For example, if a corporation was of Chinese base, it was required to pay 25% of its earnings in taxes. However, international enterprises establishing subsidiaries, factories, and production centers in the country were only required to pay between 10% and 15%, but that's not all. Furthermore, foreign corporations could deduct 100% of their employees' wages from their taxes. Also, if they reinvest their earnings, they might avoid 40 to 100% of the taxes they were supposed to pay. Investing in China became a viable option in the 1990s for two reasons. The first was the chance of achieving extremely favorable tax treatment. The second was that international firms could come and compete in the Chinese market against the rest of the Chinese businesses, which had to pay higher taxes than the foreign ones. It was essentially a VIP dinner for foreign firms. Add to that the truth that Chinese labor was extremely inexpensive at the time. As a result, worldwide investment in the Asian behemoth has surged. There were, of course, trade-offs. Companies from other countries, in addition to investing in the area, they frequently had to collaborate with local partners who grew alongside them. Above all, we learned from them, despite the fact that, as we saw at the opening of this video, the tornado of enterprises establishing themselves in China appears to have suddenly slowed. Many businesses are now thinking about limiting their exposure to China. Many have decided to leave, and the fact is that this is something that has been happening for at least a decade. Beginning in 2008, the share of international commerce in China's economy started to fall. Since then, China has moved in a direction that is far less supportive of business, investment-friendly, and global economy-friendly. The question is, what is moving China off the path that has allowed it to grow so rapidly in the past? Let's be clear about something. China had already surpassed the United States as the world's factory in 2008. Thousands of businesses had relocated to the country, and the economy had gone like a rocket. China was no longer an impoverished, desolate wasteland with no business activity, but had evolved into an industrial powerhouse with plenty of strength. Given this situation, it appears that the Chinese government decided it was no more necessary for the country to keep attracting so many international businesses if it meant damaging local businesses. Actually, it is ready to do the reverse, beginning to safeguard Chinese businesses and ceasing to grant preferential treatment to foreign investors. For example, do you recall the tax breaks available to international corporations in China? In order to earn more income, the government removed practically all of these benefits between 2008 and 2013. This could be sufficient to explain the decline in foreign investment in China. However, there is much more to be said about the growth of wage costs in China over the last few decades. From the early 2000s onwards, this cost increased, causing many corporations to abandon China in favor of other nations where labor is still inexpensive, such as Thailand or Vietnam. However, there was an extra issue, particularly in recent years, that drove many enterprises away. So, what factor is that if not the political aspect? The current president of China, Xi Jinping, took power on March 15, 2013. I recall telling you that, up until that moment, China had followed pragmatic policies that were far from communist. In the end, this is how his presidency began with his first economic program. Xi Jinping committed to play a major role in the market in 2013. Soon after, in 2014, a massive operation was undertaken to encourage mass business ownership in the country, resulting in the creation of millions of new businesses over time. Xi Jinping, on the other hand, abandoned his pragmatism and progressively replaced it with pure and hard political ideology, at least for his own brand of ideology. As a result, the current president Xi Jinping's ambition is to transform China into a dominant country with strong control over vital areas such as semiconductors, a powerhouse that has no dependence on the outside world. The Chinese economy won't continue to open up. We must abandon the notion that China's policy is still primarily focused on economic growth. According to Georg Wuck, president of the European Chamber of Commerce in China, the China that desired global openness and growth through drawing capital is a completely different China than the one we see now. But not all of China's worldwide lockout is caused by Xi Jinping, because other countries and politicians have also contributed to the escalation of the crisis. To be honest, China has not been known in recent years for keeping a positive relationship with the rest of the industrialist nations. On the one hand, its main opponent, the United States, launched an insane trade war led by Donald Trump, hastening China's isolation from the rest of the West. On the other hand, now that Trump is no longer in charge, Joe Biden has shown no inclination to loosen the sanctions. Biden has authorized tight controls on the sale of advanced technology to China. We're talking about things like semiconductors. Furthermore, policies such as the Inflation Reduction Act establish subsidiaries for some strategic enterprises that move production outside of China. The economic battle between the two powers is in full swing. Also, the social media platform, TikTok, may suffer as the U.S. Congress already has a tool to ban TikTok in the United States. Biden supports all of this. One thing should be mentioned. If you believe China's economic rivalry are limited to the United States, you are mistaken. You know, Xi Jinping has taken it upon himself to criticize almost every country in the region, from India to Malaysia, with the possible exception of Russia. And why is this so? Because these countries increasingly perceive China as a danger to their sovereignty. Actually, these countries, not the West, that are most concerned about China's drive for supremacy. According to a 2017 research done in countries such as Vietnam, India, and South Korea, nearly half of their citizens perceive China's expansion as a significant problem. As a result of all of these repercussions, such as greater taxes, higher labor expenses, and international conflict, many enterprises have begun to leave China. However, how will all of this influence us? Is it possible that international trade could collapse in the coming years? Will this war have a significant impact on our economies? Let's take a closer look. For the last few decades, globalization and, by extension, economic prosperity have been synonymous with made in China. However, if China begins to withdraw from the economic map, it is feasible that this manufactured in China boom would also go. However, this does not imply that global economic growth will cease, but rather that it may continue, but without the Asian giant, or at least with less Asian big involvement. Countries such as Malaysia, Vietnam, and even Mexico have been welcome enterprises who formerly worked in China for years. To give you an indication, 25% of Malaysia's exports are already integrated circuits with a value of around $65 billion, compared to $40 billion sold by the United States, despite the fact that the US economy is 60 to 70 times bigger than Malaysia's. Of course, whether we like it or not, none of this means that China's decoupling will be swift and easy in the short term. China remains one of the world's major markets, a market that constitutes more than 30% of the demand in key industries such as cars and semiconductors. Indeed, because of its massive economies of scale and army of engineers and highly qualified workers, China is a world leader in important industries such as electric vehicles. However, in the future, China's growing hostility towards the rest of the world, both Western and Asian, may ironically unite its adversaries and force them to work together more than ever before. Countries such as the United States, Malaysia, India, and Vietnam may band together to hasten China's pullout, and this could give globalization a new push, or at least a new period of globalization. You've heard the expression, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," but it may not have come to this. Now it's your turn. How far do you think we'll go before we stop seeing things made in China? Will the countries we've been discussing be able to attract Chinese investment, or will there be a global decrease in investment? Is it the end of globalization as we know it, or just a new phase? You can share your responses in the comments section below, and subscribe to this channel and ring the bell, so you don't miss any of our updates.